Now, the worth of a woman and the definition of what is a woman and what is a man has been defined in many ways throughout history and across societies. Now, one of the ways in which, unfortunately, society has defined what it means to be a woman or to be a successful woman is, unfortunately, it has a lot to do with how she looks. And so we live in a society right now where women are very much defined by the way they look, and how successful they are is determined by how attractive and how beautiful they can be for men. Now, Allah comes and tells us as women that we don't need to fall to that standard. We don't need to be an object, because as women, Allah tells us that our worth is defined by our relationship with Him and not by our relationship with any of His creation. And so as women, we're told by Allah, as Muslim women, we're told by Allah to actually cover ourselves. And by covering ourselves, we're covering up what's irrelevant, and that's our body, and that's our external beauty. Because what really matters in our self-worth is our character, right? And our relationship with Allah. Now, this has been, criticized. This objectification of women in this hypersexualized society has been criticized by Western feminists. But the problem is that in trying to break out of this, what has happened is that Western feminism comes into it and tries to liberate women, right, from this bondage of being a sex object. But there's one very serious problem in this so-called liberation, and that is that God has been taken out of the equation. Okay? So what happens now is that the way to liberate a woman is by making her like a man. What do I mean by that? Well, you need a standard of some sort. You need something to measure your self-worth. Okay? And if you take God out of the equation, that thing to measure your worth becomes that which is in power, right? So what happened over time is that in trying to liberate men, ironically, women began to think that they should mimic men, that they should be more like a man, and therefore they will be more honored and more dignified. And what are some examples of that? Well, for example, things which are usually considered uniquely feminine or more to do with feminine traits have been considered a degradation. Okay, so for example, to say that someone is emotional or sensitive, I mean, it's like you're insulting them, right? This has become an insult, even though the Prophet ﷺ defined these things differently. For example, we in society have defined that to cry is a measure of weakness, right? And that to not show emotion means that you're strong. And yet, the Prophet ﷺ has defined it very differently. The Prophet ﷺ, when he cried after the death of his son, people looked at him, and the men, they also kind of thought that was strange, and they were taken aback by this. And they said to him, they were like, what is this? Like, what are you doing? And the Prophet ﷺ explained that emotion that he was showing was actually connected to rahmah, to mercy. Now, if you think about rahmah, rahmah is one of the greatest attributes of God. It's a godly attribute, which is mercy. And so he's actually connected this thing with this very, very honorable quality of mercy. And yet we in society come and redefine it as weakness. And yet, ironically, the things which we consider as strength are what the Prophet ﷺ defined as weakness. And I'll give you an example. Usually in our society, men are taught, growing up, boys are taught, that they're not supposed to show emotion. But there's one emotion which boys are allowed to show, and it's considered manly and acceptable. And that's the emotion of anger. So boys basically are taught that everything they feel has to be suppressed, but the only externalization of emotion that you are allowed to show and still be manly is anger. And yet, the Prophet ﷺ explained that this is actually a sign of weakness. When the Prophet ﷺ asked his companions, who is the really strong person? And his companions, they thought a lot in a very similar way that we do. And they said, well, it's the one who can wrestle the best. So they thought about it in terms of physical strength. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, it's the one who can control themselves in the fit of anger. And so here the Prophet ﷺ is defining that lack of control of your anger is actually a sign of weakness. On the other hand, he defines showing of emotion such as crying as a sign of mercy. So look at how we flip the script in terms of our own definitions. Another example of something that's looked down upon, especially if it's seen in men, and it's considered, not masculine, is the expression of emotion in terms of affection. So the Prophet ﷺ, one time he was, showing affection to one of his children, and another one of the Arab men came and, he was trying to boast, I guess, about his own masculinity by saying that I have all these children and I never kissed them and I never hugged them and I never showed any emotion to them. And the Prophet ﷺ's response is very beautiful. He says, what can I do if mercy has been taken out of your heart? So again, this is another definition that we have of what it is to be a man, right? What it means, what masculinity means, and yet the Prophet ﷺ explains this as being a lack of mercy. To show no emotion, he connects it to a lack of mercy. Whereas to show emotion in terms of crying, he connects that to mercy. So this is interesting because, again, our definitions are completely opposite.